and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial today, I'd love to teach you a technique which I've always thought of as a double barley, but I understand that it's also known as a herringbone weave. So I've made these into a cute little pair of earrings with red crystal beads. I'm going to show you on a much larger bead, but I'll talk you through the wires that we'll need for this tutorial when we get down to the board. So here we have a slightly closer look at that double barley. It's based on my barley drop technique, which I taught a little while ago now. It's a herringbone weave, I'm led to believe. And you can see there are two slightly different looks dependent on which way up you go for. I consider this to be the face of the weave. And I've made a cute little pair of earrings to just demonstrate how that weave can be used. I've also got a bit of a sampler wire, which I've got some different beads put into the centre of those weaves just to show you how different it will look. Now I've got a small diminutive round gemstone bead here with 4 weaves on either side. I've also got a round wooden bead. Now the similarity of these is that they have slightly thicker sides on each of those beads, and that is what supports that weave. So if you have a very narrow coin bead, for instance I have this lovely piece of black spinel, but it takes down to a very narrow edge, so that really wouldn't be very good for this technique to work with. So you're looking for beads with a slightly broader edge to them. I've also got this oval goldstone glass bead to look at as well. It's quite an effective little weave to work with. So that's just some samples of how you can use it. You can put that into a ring, you can use it at the centre of the wrist, you can make many of them and then perhaps either put a plain bead on the wire or even make these into small wrapped loops either side and use it as a rosary linking component. If you're making a jumble necklace or a jumble bracelet, which is lots of different leftover things, it's quite a nice way to highlight one of the more spectacular beads in your collection. So let's talk about wire for a moment. Your core wire does need to be at least a 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I've got around about 7 inches here. I only used about 4 and a bit inches for these small earrings though. This is just because I'm going to be using a much larger bead to demonstrate the technique for you. So a minimum of 1mm or 18 gauge. The bead I'm going to demonstrate with has got a massive drill aperture in it, so you could even go for 1.25 or 16 gauge for something like that. What you'll see is this is a nice coin bead, so it's flat with very broad sides. If those sides taper down, the technique will become just a little bit less even when you come to sit the wires. Now your weaving wire, I've chosen to use a slightly heavier wire than I know a lot of people use. So this is a 0.5mm, which is equivalent to 24 gauge. Now this works beautifully with a 0.4 or 26 gauge, however it doesn't hold its shape and it can become squished out of form very easily. So I use a slightly heavier wire. If you wanted to go even one stage further and use a 0.6 or 22 gauge, you absolutely can. For the very large bead that I'm working with today, I'm going to be using a good 2 foot of wire, and that's just to see how many times we can weave back and forth on that central core. If you are using a bead with a slightly smaller drill aperture for your core wire, one of the things you can do is use a wire strengthener or wire straightener. This is a Beadalon product, and there are 2 ways that you can use it. This is the way you're supposed to use it, so you put your wire in the centre, draw that through, and it rubs against each of these little ridges on that piece. If you've got some tricky wire that's really squishy and you need to straighten it, I've got a cheats way of using this product. So what I do is I make it into a triangle shape, put the wire through that centre point, grab hold of the end and then bring it down flat. You tend to squish the very end bit, but it super strengthens and super straightens that wire. You do lose just a little bit, but if you've got a precious wire that you need to bring back, that's now super hard. It's a very useful little tool to have a hold of. So for my earrings, I made a little dropper down at the bottom in a slightly floral design or fleur-de-lis design. You could just make a spiral if that's something that you're not attracted to. I will show you how to make that design in the 1mm or 18 gauge wire, just to add a stopper to the bottom of your design, but you could use a simple head pin if you prefer, or you can pop a spiral or just a tiny little tuck just to stop the bead falling off the bottom. I'll show you now how to do that main technique. So I have around 7 inches of wire for my oversized bead. For these cute little earrings, I only used about 4.5 inches of wire. I'm going to begin by creating that little design down at the bottom. Now I've super strengthened this wire, so it's going to be a little bit tougher. And what we're going to start by doing is just rotating the end of the wire over to create that rounded shape. You'll notice it's slightly more teardrop than the beginning of a coil. I'm then going to grip very, very firmly with those bent chain nose pliers and push strongly back. If I get my hands out of the way, you'll be able to see there's kind of like a fishing hook on the bottom there. What we're going to do now is pop those round nose pliers back in and create a second round form. So I've just started that on the one side to enable me to grip them in my pliers, and hopefully you'll be able to see how this is going to form up. And I'm just making a second kind of rounded shape. I want to slightly tighten those two rounded shapes together, so I'm just going to squish them over. Now you could just push them together if it's easier, or you can grip them from above and give that a bit of a pinch. Try not to pinch your fingers in the meantime. I'm then going to grab hold of that wire again and push firmly back to create my third rounded form. And at this stage you do have the opportunity to just pinch that rounded form so it's a little bit more floral. And then we're going to use those round nose pliers again to just turn that last section over until we get a third round form that's basically similar in size. Doesn't matter if they're not perfect. I'm not going to worry about it anyway. You could just simply do a spiral if you preferred. I will just pinch those two sections together slightly closer. And then I'm going to find a central point and make this my core wire by drawing the wire sharply up. Now you can obviously spend a lot more time, simply use a head pin or pop a spiral on the bottom of your wire. So I will just close that end over and then give the whole thing a bit of a squish. You could hammer it if you wanted to. I'm working with an antique bronze today in that 1mm or 18 gauge wire. So what I do need to do now is make sure that my wire is as straight as I desire. It's kind of tricky to get that straight later on, and making sure that that's good and smooth is really helpful when we're moving the finer gauge wire around in a little while. So I'm going to add my bead onto that core wire. And just here up at the top, I'm going to turn the end over, and this is just to stop my bead from escaping at a point in the design process, because that can be a bit annoying. It's not quite the same as dropping all of your seed beads that you spent 16 hours putting together, but still, if you can avoid it going on the floor, it's all the better. So I have unspooled and cut around about 2 feet of that 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. Now in this design I used about 14 inches, and that is 3 weaves on either side, and my bead is probably around about 12mm. It's 10 to 12mm across, so that should give you some idea of what you might need if you're making a similar pair of small earrings like these ones are. So I've got my 2 foot or so of wire, and I'm just going to tuck the end over the edge of the desk. What I want to do is look at the core wire. So I'm going to start winding on, and I'm going to get 4 good rotations around my core wire with the end section closest to the bead moving down. So one of the ways that you can do this is to grip a very small amount of wire, get a couple of rotations around, and then if you're being thrifty and you want to preserve your wire, you can just switch your hands around and make that tail disappear until you can see 4 good rotations around the core. Your other option is to not be thrifty and just trim that tiny tail away. So you will just need to make sure that everything is neat and tidy and there's no naughty sticky uppy bits. So if I put this back into its original orientation like so, so it will hang down like this when it's done. But if I turn it over onto its side, you can see we've got 4 visible wraps. 3 of them are by themselves and the end is closest to the bead. You just rotate that in the light, you should get a good image of what we're doing. And then I've got the tail of wire coming away. Now when you're not working with a camera, you can even leave this attached to your reel to avoid wastage. What I tend to do, as I said, there's about 14 inches in a small pair of earrings like this, and you'll usually find uses for tiny offcuts anyway. So you'll see that there's a little bit of work hardening has happened in this wire already. So I just want to run my fingers over that just once or twice to make sure that it's smooth. I don't want to over harden it. I'm currently around about an inch away from the base of my design, and it doesn't really matter if you're a little bit further or a little bit nearer, because this will stay fluid. You'll be able to move that up and down just a little bit. What I'm going to do now is show you the side of the design. The reason I've chosen such a thick bead is because it amply demonstrates how to achieve the effect. What we're looking to do is take our finer wire from the top of that core wire all the way around the edge of the bead. So if I press that down on the edge, the outside of the bead, I'm just going to pinch that with my forefinger and draw the tail of wire across the top of the core wire on the opposite side of the bead. I'm then going to draw that around nice and neatly so that I have 4 visible wraps, like so. So there's the first wrap, which is attached to the wire that's already travelled around the side of the bead. And then I've got 2 wraps, and then I've got a 4th wrap which comes off to the tail of wire. So we're going to reorient this to make it as easy as possible for you or for me. And again, I'm just going to smooth through that wire once, and I'm going to draw it around the side of that bead. I'm going to ensure it's sitting nicely on the side of the bead and draw the tail over the top surface of that core wire that we're working with. And it does help to have this nice and firm, so you can use the hardest, thickest wire that you can get through the drill aperture, or you can harden it slightly by either nom-nomming it with your flat pliers, like so, or you can use the wire straightener tool. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that I pull that wire taut over the surface of that core wire, so that it sits on the outside, furthest away from the bead, on top of that core, and then I'm going to rotate it once, twice, 3 times. So we have a matching 4 visible wraps around that core. And I'm just going to use my nails to scooch that down towards the bead. We're simply going to repeat that until we run out of space on the side of the bead. Now this is slightly rotating, which is absolutely fine because it will build up in gradual strength as we go. Now the next thing that you need to be aware of is we've got that finer gauge wire. It's always travelling over the surface of the core wire, and it just wraps around underneath, and it's always travelling off the surface, off the top rather, onto the top. But when we come to do our second pass of wire around the outside of the bead, we want it to sit on the outside of the bead but underneath our first pass of wire. So you can see our first pass of wire is just sitting on the side of the bead around the outside edges. I'm going to draw the second layer underneath. So if this is the top, this is the first pass of wire, the second pass of wire needs to be further in this direction. And I'm going to pinch that again with my finger and just run my thumb and forefinger over this side to put a little bit more residual strength. Allow the wire to pass on top of that core wire. If it just dances in the light, you'll see it is further away from the bead. It's not going over the top of anything, it's sitting on top of that core wire. I'm going to pinch that firmly in position whilst I rotate that long, thin piece of wire 4 times around that core. Use my nails to scooch it up and then rotate the design around again. So one little smoothness through. You can see that we're on the second side that we're working. So our first pass of wire on that bead is nearest the top of the design. The next pass of wire must touch the side of the bead as well, but be underneath. So it is adjacent to that first pass of wire. But if you were looking from the top, you can only see the top wire. Everything else is hiding behind it. So again, a little bit of smoothness helps. Draw the tail of wire around, ensuring it's on top of that core wire, but it doesn't press into the preceding wraps. So hold that nicely in position, and you'll see there's a bit of bagging here, which is absolutely fine because as I push that down, you'll be able to straighten that out and get it to sit how you desire, how it looks best. If anything comes out of true, you can just smooth it into position. Everything from here on in is a repeat of the same technique, bearing in mind we've got 2 passes of wire on the side of the bead now. So our third pass of wire, let's get that strong and straight, just 2 times with thumb and forefinger. It needs to go beneath and behind the preceding passes of wire. I'm going to hold that firmly into position, draw the tail of wire over the surface of that core, hold it firmly into position, 1, 2, 3. We've got 4 visible wraps. Now you can play around with the numbering with these wraps to whatever suits your design. Sometimes you'll only want to spin around twice because you're working with a teeny tiny bead. If you're working with a round bead, you get a slightly different appearance. Here's another little sampler. And this is what can happen with a slightly lighter wire as well. It can deform really easily. So I'm just going to continue until my wire runs out. What I would aim for is the same number of passes of wire that you can see around the outside. So there's 2 here and 3 here. So if we add a third pass on this side, you can see wire number 1, wire number 2 is underneath it. So wire number 3 needs to go underneath that. Once you've got that in position, you can pinch the bead, bring the tail wire all the way around, making sure it goes over the top of that core wire. And again, we're wrapping to just neatly snuggle around that core wire. So I'm going to continue again and see how many more passes of wire I can get. Let's see what will fit on here. So this is pass of wire number 4, so it needs to sit underneath those first passes of wire, but it will always have the tail passing across the surface of the core wire. So let's pull that into position. You can see that's gone a little bit taut, but as soon as we push that wire down neatly, we can just hook that out gently. It's much better to do this if you can by hand rather than to use tools. If you start pulling this with a pair of pliers, you may get wrinkles in the wire that you don't like the look of. So once that's nicely set into position, let's see if we can get another pass of wire. So this is pass of wire number 4. Smooth that wire through. Allow that to sit underneath the preceding 4 wires. I'm going to pinch that firmly whilst I bring this last section of tail wire over the surface of the core, and then I'm going to pinch that into position whilst I wrap the prerequisite number of times around. Now I probably do have enough wire here on the end to make another couple of sections on this piece of double barley or herringbone technique, but I think that's enough to demonstrate the idea of what we're looking to do. So because this is the front, I would take that wire across the back of the design, trim away. Now I used an absolutely gargantuan bead today to make it easy for me to show you how those wires stack on the side. You certainly won't need anywhere near that amount of wire with those smaller beads. So once you're happy that you've got all of the wraps on your herringbone that you desire, what I'm going to do is scooch this very, very gently down until it sits exactly where I want it to. So just pushing and compressing, making sure I'm happy with how those wires are sitting. You can just very, very gently just edit the way that that looks. Ideally with a nail, you'll get a much more gentle result. And all I will do to finish off then is a wrapped loop up at the top, which I'm not going to explain endlessly, because you've seen it so very many times. So I'm just rotating around a circular form, squishing that down, ready to be attached into my earring finding, holding that round form, and then filling the gap with a couple of rotations and cutting off at the back. Give that a squish so it doesn't stick out and catch, and you are golden. So let's pop that in the scrap pot for later and have a look at the earrings that go with. Obviously you can change that core wire if you need to. You can change the orientation of the loop rather. Don't try and pull it off the wire now because it'll all come unravelled. So those are your earrings in a pair with red crystal, and there's your demonstration with a giant piece of, I imagine, jasper. I don't know, I found it in my stash. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today and making the double barley or herringbone technique. I hope that you will enjoy making those as earrings, as components, connectors, jumble necklaces and bracelets, centerpieces for bangles and so on. So many ways in which you can use it other than just a cute pair of earrings. I look forward to seeing you here again very, very soon. Have yourself a beautiful day. Bye for now.